Welcome, everyone, to the ADHD podcast. Today, we're going to talk about something that's pretty rough. It is one of those things that a lot of people do not understand enough about, in my opinion, and that is neurodivergent burnout. One of the things that people need to understand about this is that when we are really at our lowest, when the world seems like it's just completely overwhelming, we're tired constantly. It doesn't mean it's depression. It can be something else. And that's a rough thing to understand when it comes to talking to your doctor about what you're going through, because what doctors are going to talk about is going to be depression, because the symptoms are very similar. The thing is neurodivergent burnout and being that tired and your body hurting isn't laziness, weakness, or it's a bad attitude. It's literally your brain hitting a wall because you've been running at 200% just to meet baseline expectations. And honestly, most dads and most men out there don't recognize burnout until you're already in the crater. The thing that you need to understand is you're not tired, you're depleted. And there's a huge difference.
Yeah, I really ran into this back in 2020, which was at the time, I had gotten laid off from my job. A month later, I started a new job that was having me drive all over the state and be away from home a lot. And then a month later, my son was born and we were starting COVID and having a newborn, dealing with the isolation of COVID and also having to drive all over the place and not be home with your kid while my wife was dealing with it. I didn't realize it until I was in the complete throes of burnout with all of that, and I was just trying to do all the things. And so it really doesn't hit you until you're there. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. I think that burnout, it hits hard and it hits fast when it does hit. And I think that learning the difference between depression and everything, and also dealing with potentially your partner having the same thing, is going to be really, really key to it.
So, one of the things that a lot of people struggle with whenever they're thinking that there's something wrong with them, they go to the doctor and they talk about all the different issues: fatigue, withdrawal, loss of motivation, even more so than what's normal for ADHD, irritability. And the reason why so many doctors struggle with this is because those symptoms are extremely similar to what people deal with when it comes to depression. The thing is, depression is a clinical condition that involves brain chemistry. The serotonin in your brain isn't being produced, or it's not being processed correctly. And there's no real trigger always when it comes to depression. It can just be seasonal depression, it can be different issues that are related to trauma and issues like that. It can also just be a thing where your brain doesn't produce the serotonin correctly. Burnout is a result of sustained demand exceeding capacity over time. There's almost always a cause, even if you're not able to see it yet. Neurodivergent burnout specifically often comes from masking, sensory overload, executive function depletion, and the constant effort operating into systems that weren't really designed for your brain. It's a cumulative damage, not a single event. And for a lot of dads, the provider expectation accelerates this. You're burning through your reserves at work, coming home to a second shift of parenting demands, and the recovery time that you and your spouse need doesn't exist on y'all's schedule. And autistic burnout can really look like skill regression. Things that you used to handle fine suddenly seem impossible. That's not you getting worse, that's your brain pulling the emergency brake.
Yeah, and I think that when I was going through burnout, I, having gone through and actually dealt with depression myself and knowing the difference, I think the biggest difference for me was seeing how long it took to recover and how hard it was to recover from. Because once you're in the middle of it, it's not something that you can heal from in a week or even sometimes a month or more when taking care of it. It takes a long time to recover from. And I think it's really important to make that distinction because when you are in the throes of burnout, it's not just a chemical imbalance, it's your body telling you that it can't handle anymore.
Yeah, the danger zone in this realm is when burnout gets misdiagnosed as depression. A lot of times doctors will put you on SSRIs when what you really need is reduced demand and recovery time. I've talked about this before, but I always compare burnout to being the broken bone of the mind. Your body has stressed something in your mind to the point of breaking. And that stress, that fracture, that breaking can cause a significant number of issues. And when you're put on SSRIs and you think that it's working to help the depression that you're going through, what it's really doing is it's masking the problem while the root cause keeps grinding you down. You keep trying to push through while you're on a medication, and your body legitimately is not in a place where it can, and your mind definitely isn't. One of the ways that I really understand this is in my own personal journey with burnout. In 2018, I developed crushing burnout. But when I went and talked to the doctor, they were convinced it was depression and they put me on SSRIs. One of the biggest issues is when you're on SSRIs and you're on ADHD medication is you can develop side effects from being on SSRIs, headaches, issues with sleep, different things of that nature, irritability can get worse, a number of different things. But one of the worst ones, I think, especially for men, is suicidal ideation. And that's what I dealt with. There was a couple of points in my life where if there had been a firearm in that house, I wouldn't be here today. And that terrified me at that moment. Like the next day, I called the hospital and I was like, hey, I think there's something wrong with me. And I went in and I talked to them and they did some testing and they were like, yeah, you are dealing with some serious issues with your serotonin. We're going to take you off the depression medication. We think it's causing serotonin syndrome. And that is something that I had never even heard of before. And it freaked me the heck out because one of the things that I've always prided myself in was even when I was homeless, even when I was literally at my worst, I never felt like it was okay to end anything. And at that point in my life, I did. And that's one of the reasons why I thought that this conversation really needed to be had, because a lot of us are out there thinking that we're dealing with depression, and what we're really dealing with is burnout, and the are completely different.
And I think it's really important too to note that they can both be happening at the same time. And you can actually be suffering from depression and burnout. And, it's important that causes it to be really hard to untangle. And I think it's really important to be able to be open about your communication and talking about things because like in your case, if you hadn't have made that choice to actually talk to a doctor about it, that could have kept going and gotten a lot worse.
And that was one of the things that they told me. They were like, "We really appreciate you coming in and having this conversation because this would have gotten worse if you had kept going and things of that nature." And I think that this is one of those points where we really have to talk about the importance about asking for help. I mean, honestly, most of us were raised in a message that asking for help means that you failed and that that's some sort of personal, like moral failure on your part. That message is garbage. But it's really wired deep but it's really wired deep into our psyche as men. The thing that y'all need to understand that asking for help is a strategy. It's not a surrender. Every successful person that you've ever admired has a team behind them and people that care about them and people that they go to when they're struggling. Nobody does this kind of stuff alone, and the ones that say that they do are really lying about that. What I want you to understand is that you can start small. You don't have to have a breakdown to justify asking for support. You can tell your spouse or your partners or your friends, hey, I need like 20 minutes to decompress before I can really be present in this conversation. I'm dealing with a lot of stuff. That's asking for help. That's asking for grace and the acknowledgement that you need just a few minutes to kind of decompress before you're able to be social with your people. Sometimes talking to your spouse and saying, hey, I can't do bedtime tonight. I'm really tapped out. Can I do bedtime tomorrow night and you take tonight, and like shifting the gears of that conversation so that you're taking care of yourself and you're making sure that you're doing your duties as a father. Like that's asking for help. And communicating this can be hard, but it's really necessary. For neurodivergent dads specifically, the barrier is often like RSD and rejection sensitivity. We're scared of the rejection of being seen as weaker. The thing is, you may be terrified about asking and that you're going to deal with disappointment, frustration, or things of that nature, but legitimately, the people who care about you will show that care in that moment. And those that don't probably don't need to be in your life.
And I think a big part of it too comes from all the stigmas that, as men, we're supposed to be the providers and the stoic, strong ones, the rock for the family, that kind of thing. And I think that it really comes down to being able to realize that there are times when even rocks can break. And before I suffered from my burnout, I always had a really hard time asking for help from anybody. And it came down to a point where I was working 15 to 16 or more hours a day, coming home, trying to help care for my infant son. And we didn't even really have a schedule at the time of alternating or anything like that, taking care of them. And so it got to a point where I was just trying to take on everything. When I saw my wife was struggling, I tried to step in even and take care of things. And it got to a point where I cracked and I just couldn't. And I basically ceased to function. And so it's really important to understand that everything has its breaking point, no matter how hard, no matter how stoic, no matter how firm.
Yeah, and I think this is where that conversation often gets the most uncomfortable is when we're dealing with our partners. But it does need to be discussed because the people that we're with really matter. And sometimes your partner's expectations aren't really aligned with your actual capacity. And that's not an excuse. It's the reality that has to be addressed pretty honestly. A lot of neurodivergent dads are operating on a fundamentally different energy budget than their partners get. They may have neurotypical expectations, they may have their own struggles that they're dealing with, and they need to understand that you're not choosing to be less available. You're genuinely running out of resources faster because your brain is working harder to do the same things. And you yourself may have these expectations of having been able to put up and deal with these things from the past. And that's where things get really confusing. I always think about the football star in high school. You know what I mean? I used to be able to run a 4.40, and I used to be able to bench press 600 pounds, and I used to be able to da 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 da. And I, like myself, I've been guilty of those things. And, but at the same time, I have to understand that I'm 44 now. I'm not in a place where I could do those things, even if I wanted to do those things, or even if I wanted to try to do some of those things that I used to do. My body and mind are just not in that same place. And we have to also adjust our expectations ourselves.
And I think it's really important to jump in and have the energy conversations with our partners frequently because, kind of like you said, where we made been able to do something once upon a time, our energy levels change as we grow older, as our life circumstances change. And I really think that being able to have that conversation of, okay, this is where my energy's at, along with your partner, is really important. And also, I'd say the reverse of that, keeping track of where your partner's energy levels are at, because if their energy levels are low and you're not ready for it, that can throw us for a loop as well. So I think that that's a really important part of the conversation is understanding where you're at right now, not necessarily where you could have been at one point in time. The conversation isn't to lower your expectations. It's let me show what I'm actually dealing with so we can build something realistic together. That framing matters.
Yeah, because if your partner doesn't understand neurodivergence, even if they're neurodivergent themselves, that's an education gap, not a character flaw. But it's also not your job to burn yourself down proving that you're trying hard enough. Like, both things can be true. Like, you can have a place where you're in dealing with so much burnout that you're not able to explain to your spouse or your partner that you're going through these things. But the conversation does need to be had. And I think that that's one of those places where so many of us struggle when we're trying to get our partners who may also be neurodivergent and going through their own burnout, where we can have that conversation. And then there's the other side of that coin is the person who doesn't care. And that's an entirely different conversation.
Yeah. And I think that it's a lot of times the reason that they may not care is because they could also be suffering from their own source of burnout as well. And so I think that it's really important to focus on kind of the order of burnout, right? So if as you're approaching things, yes, you're both burnout, but you need to focus on the person that addressed it first and focus on that burnout or focus on their struggles, and then you can have a back and forth. When it comes to these situations, couples coaching and couples therapy with someone who understands what neurodivergence affects, how neurodivergence affects relationships, that can be really important. Having that neutral third party who can translate between your two different operating systems. And it might not necessarily be that one person is neurotypical and the other is neurodivergent. You could both be neurodivergent, but just different. And that's okay. The goal is partnership, it's not performance. If you're performing for your spouse the same way you perform at work, then you're also masking at home. And we've already talked about where that leads.
Yeah, so what I want to talk about now is I want to shift into the healing, right? We kind of touched on it a little bit before. And Braden, you mentioned it as well. Like, this isn't a weekend off or a week off or a month off. This isn't a vacation. Now, those things help, but they don't fix the actual structural problem. If you go back to the same demands after you've done taken some time off and healed and things of that nature with the same lack of support, you're going to be right back into the crater. Step one is honestly identifying what's draining you. And this is one of those places where I had to audit my life, kind of like I used to audit project management jobs. And the biggest issue in this realm for people with ADHD and autism is our lack of interoception. That's our body's ability to feel what's going on internally, right? Am I hungry? Am I sleepy? Am I tired? Am I in pain? Do I have to go to the bathroom? That also applies here as well, which is why it seems like this is such a sudden shift from being able to do the things to not being able to do the things. We've gotten to the point where our body has just started shutting down because our mind has started shutting down. So you have to take a step back, and this is usually best done with a therapist, with a coach, somebody who can really help you identify where the energy is going. and also identify what's non-negotiable and what can be delegated or dropped or even restructured.
And I think it's really important to note that recovery actually requires rest, not just distracting yourself disguised as rest. Scrolling your phone for 3 hours, that's not recovery. Sleep, it's important to consider that things like sleep and reduced sensory input, time without demands on your executive function, things like that are recovery. You need to build recovery into your system. It's not a reward for hitting a wall, it's a regular part of how we need to operate. If you wait until you're already burned out to rest, then you're always going to be playing catch up, and that's never going to work.
I think another thing is that healing also means grief. Like you may need to grieve the version of yourself that could power through everything from when you were younger, right? Like there was a lot of us back in the day that could have probably done a backflip, you know what I mean? And we may not be able to do a backflip anymore. And that's okay, right? There's a lot of other stuff that we can do. The thing that I think we need to start accepting about ourselves is as we get older, that person isn't coming back. And honestly, it's probably a lot of the decisions that we were making when we were younger that's honestly killing us today. I think everybody needs to lower the bar on what functional looks like during recovery. Your house can be messy. Dinner can be cereal. The kids can have extra screen time. None of that makes you a bad parent. It makes you a parent who's choosing to heal so that you can actually show up in the long term. If you're listening to this and you're in this right now, if you're feeling a lot of this struggle and you're dealing with a lot of the energy loss and the tiredness and all of the pain and stuff like that, you need to understand that you're not broken. Your brain isn't defective. You've been running on a system that wasn't designed for how you're wired, and it's finally caught up. That's not failure, that's information. And the thing that you need to know is now you can do something about it.
And I think when I was recovering, I had to make a lot of changes in my life. I had to talk to a lot of people in my life to be able to learn to ask for help. And during that time, because of the new job, the kid, everything, I knew that I needed to have more time for myself. And so I had to start looking for a job that would allow me the time I needed to heal. I think that it doesn't necessarily mean that everything in life has to disappear and you just only focus on that stuff because life's still going to be going on around you. But I think that finding time to be able to have that rest and recovery and good rest and recovery, not just distraction, is really important. So pay attention to yourself, make sure you're taking care of yourself. And I use the analogy of the oxygen mask. You got to be able to take care of yourself before you can help others. So, with that, thank you for listening and like, subscribe, comment, share, click all the things, and we'll see you guys next time.